And now I call upon our Turkish friend, Ayhan Kaya from Istanbul Bilgi University on Europe versus Islam, a very actual issue.
Thank you very much. Yeah, that's great. I was not really sure if I should use my presentation. I decided I should because there are some electoral posters from different countries of the populist parties. Let me just start thanking Jeff and all the others for making this possible. And it's really great to be here in Berlin, where I started my PhD fieldwork back in the late 1990s in a youth center in Kreuzberg, now in Ritze, where I was working with the hip-hop youngsters, the graffiti artists and the rappers, Turkish origin, rappers. So it's also great to see again that rap and hip-hop is, being revitalized recently. I followed Bushido and all the other polemical, things happening in Germany. And I will talk about the latest research that we conducted in 6 countries in a while. But let me just start saying that as a social scientist working on majority and minority dynamics from sociological and anthropological perspectives, rather than starting problematizing the minorities, I prefer to start problematizing the majorities. Following the traces of Mark Twain and Henrik Ibsen, who once said completely in different occasions, in different contexts, that minorities are usually right, majorities are usually wrong. And I really stick to this assumption. I know it is very problematic, but this is what I see, this is what I experience in the field. So I will do the same here. So instead of diagnosing all these populists, right-wing populist followers as a bunch of fascists, a bunch of Nazis, a bunch of right-wing people, racist and xenophobe and Islamophobe, I will not do that. On the contrary, I will try to understand, as a social scientist, what these people actually want, what these people talk about, what these people problems are in a way. We're looking at populism, especially right-wing populism, in a time of crisis, characterized with the global financial crisis on the one hand, and the refugee crisis on the other hand. And we should not forget about the historical analysis, because the things that we talk about, Islamophobia, in relation to populism, current right-wing populism, Islamophobia has been there. As someone working on Islamophobia as well, I could trace the modern Islamophobia all the way back to 1970s. 1974, oil crisis, and blaming the Muslims living in European countries and creating scapegoats, etc. So I see a great relevance of the rise of Islamophobia on the one hand and the rise of the neoliberal governance on the other hand. So I'm basically as someone who is trying to criticize the rise of neoliberal governance in every aspect of our everyday life. So basically, what we did is to look at the growing populism in 6 European countries within the framework of a Horizon 2020 research called COHERE, Critical Heritages, run by Newcastle University. I'm the leader of the work package 2 on populism. Although the project is about museums, is about the critical heritages and how we could reformulate the museums to instrumentalize them in a way to create some more cohesive European public where differences could also be represented better. Just a bit of theory about populism. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the literature on populism in Europe. First time in modern times, we come across the studies on populism with this famous famous conference organized by Ernest Gellner, Isaiah Berlin, and all the others in 1967 in the LSE. And here, one of the things that, Isaiah Berlin stated during the conference, he said, well, I think we are all probably agreed that a single formula to cover all populisms is not really possible. You know? So it is better not to be so generalizing. It's better not to be so generalistic. It's better to be concentrating on the local aspects of populism in a way. So this is one of my first assumptions, because populism is a very local phenomena. So even I actually tempted to criticize myself when I come up with a title, for instance, populism in Germany, populism in France, populism in Italy. This is why we picked up cities where we studied populism, where we interviewed 20 people, followers of the right-wing populist parties, in-depth interviews in Toulon, in Dresden, Athens, Rome, Rotterdam, and Istanbul. And basically, our premise was that populism is a symptom. Populism is an outcome of the long-lasting structural problems of exclusion, structural problems of alienation, structural problems of discrimination with respect to globalization, with respect to neoliberal governance, with respect to deindustrialization, et cetera, et cetera. I found myself intrigued because I was previously working on the Muslim origin migrants living in the European countries. And I was looking at the youngsters. Then I started to focus on the native populations affiliated with right-wing populism. It was fascinating to realize that actually there is a process of radicalization on both sides, generated from the same similar social economic constraints, driven from globalization, driven from neoliberalism, driven from neoliberal forms of governance, right? So then this actually will take me to the next stage. I've recently been granted a European Research Council advanced grant, and I will, starting from next year on, I will concentrate on radicalization on both sides. I'm not going to talk about religion. I'm not going to talk about civilization. I'm going to talk about social economic constraints. I'm going to talk about psychological constraints, alienation. I'm going to talk about humiliation, you know. I'm going to talk about political constraints. So this is in a way, I mean, my stance is in a way trying to bring back the social, economic, and psychological parameters back. I'm not going to go into detail of the methodology, but basically in literature, we have three ways of looking at populism at the moment. Anti-globalization approach, anti-elitist approach, and populism as a political style. I'm personally using all these three theories in an eclectical way because I find them fascinating to use all of them together to explain different contexts differently. For instance, anti-globalization thesis is very explanatory for Brexit. And anti-elitist approach is very explanatory in many different parts of the European Union. But the populism as a political style coming from Laclau and all the others is a great way of looking at populism because what the populist parties are doing is very successfully manipulate social, economic, political, and psychological constraints of these people. So when we look at populism as a political style, we see quite impressive common denominators in all the populist party leaders, irrespective of being they are in power or in opposition. I just here summarize. For instance, they are all appealing to the dichotomy between people and the elite. We all know about this, right? On the other hand, all the populist leaders have certain manners, Mostly they are bad manners. They're not politically correct. They prefer not to be in order to become closer to the people which they represent. But of course, this people is a very selective people. It is mostly, half of the population. This is constructed definition of the people. They are ordinary. This is the way how they make themselves appealing to the people. If you follow Erdoğan, Erdoğan is a very ordinary person, and he's doing it very successfully, right? Or many other leaders that we are following recently in the European political space. But of course, it is not enough to be ordinary to be a good leader, right? You also need to be extraordinary. When we look at the history of these political leaders, Chavez, he presented himself as the reincarnation of Simon Bolivar, or Berlusconi. Berlusconi once declared himself as the Jesus Christ of politics. Erdoğan declared himself as the shepherd of the people, right? And etc. So these are also some of the really interesting common denominators. The other thing which is, again, very visible in all the populist leaders is that they live on crisis. If there is no crisis, they are very well in creating one. They scandalize. They basically fabricate problems. They dramatize the problems. So this is really one of the very good theories that I'm personally very much using at the moment. We looked at different common tropes that we have encountered in the field. I'm not going to go through all the tropes, but I just picked up the ones relevant to this conference. Multiculturalism, a very strong critique of multiculturalism everywhere you see. They're feeling lost in diversity, this is for sure. They're feeling lost in unity, this is for sure. So they're Eurosceptic, they are multiculturalism skeptic. So there is something that the European Commission should do definitely about this, because unity and diversity discourse is not functioning, at least for these people, right? So migration, in terms of migration, this is again a very interesting phenomena. We have seen in the field with our interlocutors, they are not mostly in opposition to the refugees. This is important. They are not against refugees. On the contrary, they explicitly state that they are in favor, they are actually in support of those people who really need support. But then that takes us to the other common trope. They are quite Islamophobist, right? But then here, let me just quote a very interesting quotation here from Rotterdam, a 56-year-old manual worker. They say, the young Turks are even worse, While their parents or grandparents were grateful to us, the young Turks are no longer doing that. On the contrary, they are becoming radical. They are becoming very outspoken. As someone working on integration, working on migration, I would argue that, well, if these youngsters are becoming outspoken in public, that means they are actually quite integrated, because they're running after their rights. They're running after their, processes of exclusion, subordination, discrimination, etc., right? So, but this is not the way they interpret, of course. So there is still something with Islam, Islamophobia, Islamophobism, etc. And then one of the things which is really fascinating with the recent right-wing populist parties, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I'm not using the term extreme right, because they are very different from the extreme right-wing parties that we used to know in the past. National Party Deutschland, extreme right-wing, fascist. But these parties, using welfare policies discourse, using a quite interesting political discourses to heal the poor, the neglected ones, etc. But also recently, they are also successful in mobilizing those women, LGBTI people, and even the Jews. So this is why these parties are becoming mainstream political parties. So using the inclusion moderation thesis, I assume, as a political scientist, I assume that these parties will not remain as radical parties. On the contrary, they will become centrist, mainstream political parties. So there is nothing to worry about. This is what I'm trying to say, right? But we need to be careful in the sense that the leadership of these political parties are great in the sense that they are using the social media very successfully. They're using the past very successfully. They're using heritage very successfully as a part of this populist style. In terms of leadership, there is also a really interesting thing. There's not really a very strong leader cult. In Germany, there is not a very strong leader cult, for instance. Maybe in France a little bit, but because Front National is a bit different from the others. So I know that I'm coming to the end of my presentation, but let me just, as I cannot really go into detail of all the countries, but let me just draw your attention to the German case a little bit. I see that we looked at Dresden, and I see that there are still unresolved issues in the minds of these people about the reunification. Empty promises, still hanging, leaning up there. The average age in Saxony, in East German provinces, is like 4 years older than the average age in Germany. Aging population. Maybe on the streets of Dresden you don't really see Muslims because they're not really Muslims. The fear is coming from the media, it's coming from the social media, it's coming from the things that we talk about, we gossip about. It's coming from ISIS, it's coming from Al-Qaeda, etc. But I think Islamophobia is a mainstream discourse to be exploited by right-wing populist people to draw the public attention, the global attention to their problems. Imagine they were talking about their social economic, let's say, disparities, because they think that they're not really getting enough share from the prosperous German economy. Nobody would care about this discourse. But when you use an Islamophobic discourse, they know that the whole world will concentrate on that. This is why Pegida has become so successful. This is why AfD has become so successful. Just a couple of slides from France. Jeanne d'Arc, using the history, using the past. Le Pen always organized her rallies in the Palais de Jeanne d'Arc, not in Palais de République, not in Palais de Nation, but always Jeanne d'Arc. So this historical figures, heritage is coming back to save the country from the intrusion of the neoliberal, global, companies, etc., right? And here, authenticity, common trope that we see in AfD's posters, authenticity and nativity. Well, I'm asking these posters to my German students, and they don't know really where these authentic dresses are actually coming from, because there's no authenticity in such a globalized world. So these are just this one, right? So from Italy, Raphael, you know these figures very well. Roman soldiers protecting Italy from the intrusion of the others. And of course, this is the most famous one, Wilders. But recently, there is another one. I don't know if you're following the Dutch case, this platform for democracy, I think. A PhD guy who did his PhD in Leiden University. It's a good thesis, actually, but he's the shining star of the populist right. This is the Golden Dawn, clean up the dirt in our country, very racist. This was not used. And some fun from Turkey, the use of the heritage, Ottoman and Islamist heritage, by the Justice and Development Party and Erdogan himself, very successfully here. This is really, I know, is recently more popular in Germany than he is in Turkey. But yeah, I mean, here I talked about, you will also see it in the paper, I talked about why the myths become so revitalized in the age of neoliberalism, created and played by the right-wing populists, simply because the myths provide many people with a very easy, answer, with a very, not really deep world, not really complex world. So in the myths, we become the heroes of our own stories, escaping from the detrimental effects of populism. So let me just conclude, Mr. Moderator. I think one of the striking things that we have also witnessed in the field is that this is also very relevant for the content of this workshop, is that mostly pious Christians are not really populists in the European context. Populists, right-wing populists, are mostly coming from those atheist, secular, laicist, agnostic people who are in need of a community to protect themselves against the detrimental effects of globalization. Christians don't need communities. They already have one. But atheists, LGBTI, women, secular. So this is not really about religion. This is not about, on the contrary, they understand each other extremely well. Somebody said in the morning, they're all Abrahamic religions, right? Right? You say that? Yeah. So they understand each other very well. So let me just leave with you a very, a great poet that I appreciate. It's a long poet, of course. In order to be, I must be another. Leave myself, search for myself in the others. Octavio Paz. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Professor Kaya, thank you very much for your very interesting description of similarities and differences in the populist right-wing scene in Europe. If I try to find out what you are proposing as a solution, the non-populist politicians must work harder on solving crises. Crises are the bottom where populists can grow. Not an easy task. Populists always give very easy answers, and the not easy answers are the right ones, unfortunately. Thank you very much.